There is a particular kind of death that occurs when a machine is dismantled, when the accumulated knowledge of how to build it and maintain it and operate it is scattered and lost, when the people who understood the machine pass away and are not replaced by new people trained in the understanding they carried. This death is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It occurs gradually, quietly, through the simple passage of time and the changes that time brings to what people value and what people choose to learn. A locomotive can be preserved in a museum, protected from the elements, maintained in a condition that preserves its physical form, and still experience this kind of death, because the knowledge of how to operate it, how to diagnose its problems, how to understand what it was asking when it gave certain signals, can disappear even while the machine itself persists. The locomotive whose story this is was a sophisticated machine for its era, a design that incorporated solutions to problems that had taken decades of incremental improvement to solve. The men who operated it were trained in the specific knowledge necessary to work with it, trained in how to read the subtle signals that the locomotive gave through its behavior, trained in the judgment calls that kept the locomotive operating smoothly. The men who maintained it understood the intricate systems that made it function, understood how to diagnose problems by sound and by feeling, understood the sequence of steps that different maintenance operations required. All of this knowledge lived in the men who worked with the machine. The knowledge was not written down in any comprehensive way. It was transmitted through apprenticeship, through years of working alongside experienced men who showed younger men how things were done. When the diesel transition came, and when steam locomotives began to disappear from regular service, the knowledge that had been accumulated over decades began to disappear as well. The men who carried the knowledge retired. Younger men, if they had learned at all, had learned only the limited knowledge necessary to maintain and operate the particular locomotive they worked with, not the broader understanding of steam locomotive operation that would have allowed them to transfer that knowledge to different machines or to understand the principles that different designs expressed. The locomotive in question was eventually preserved, rescued from scrapping by a heritage organization that recognized that it was an important representative of its class. The locomotive was brought to a museum facility, was protected from the weather, was maintained in good physical condition. The physical machine was saved. What was not saved was the knowledge of how to operate it, how to diagnose its problems, how to understand what the locomotive was expressing through its behavior. Years passed. The men who had operated the locomotive in regular service grew old and died. Their knowledge went with them, irreplaceable and gone. The men who had maintained the locomotive in regular service eventually passed away as well, and with them went the practical understanding of how the machine's intricate systems worked. The locomotive sat in the museum, preserved, visible, a historical artifact that people could look at and photograph. But it was a machine whose language was no longer spoken, whose needs could no longer be read with the fluency that years of regular operation had provided. The question eventually arose of whether the locomotive should be restored to operating condition. Heritage railway organizations had begun the work of restoring steam locomotives to operation in the late 20th century, running them on short excursion trains, giving people the experience of riding behind a steam locomotive, preserving the knowledge of how to operate these machines by actually operating them. The locomotive in the museum was a candidate for restoration. The organization that cared for it began the work of understanding what restoration would require. What they discovered was that restoring the locomotive to operation was not simply a matter of mechanical repair. Restoring the locomotive was a matter of recovering knowledge that had largely been lost, of reconstructing from incomplete sources the understanding of how the machine should behave, what the different systems were supposed to do, how problems should be diagnosed and fixed. The men who had this knowledge were nearly all gone. The few who remained, who had operated or maintained the locomotive or machines of similar design, were elderly. The knowledge they carried existed in their heads and nowhere else, no longer embedded in the community of practice that would have transmitted it to the next generation. The restoration effort became an effort to interview the remaining men who remembered, to extract from their memories and from their knowledge the understanding of how the locomotive worked. The organization that was doing the restoration conducted interviews, recorded conversations, documented what the elderly men knew about the machine and about machines of its type. The knowledge was being recovered, not through the normal process of apprenticeship and gradual learning, but through the desperate effort to capture it before it was permanently lost. What emerged from this process was a recognition that the knowledge was fragmentary, that no single person remembered everything, that the understanding was distributed across multiple people, and that piecing it together required interviewing many different people and reconciling what they knew and finding the places where their knowledge overlapped, or where different aspects of the system could be combined into a functional understanding of the whole. The restoration team had to become, in a sense, the new repository of knowledge that had previously been distributed across a community of practice. They had to become fluent in a language that was no longer being spoken, had to learn to read signals that no one had trained them to read, had to develop the judgment that years of experience had developed in men who were now no longer available to teach. The restoration took years. It required recruiting people who had experience with steam locomotives, either through heritage railway work or through knowledge preserved in other contexts. It required careful documentation and experimentation and trial and error as the restoration team learned what worked and what did not. It required a kind of reconstruction of knowledge that was half memory and half engineering inference, half attempting to do what the old men said should be done, and half figuring out why doing it that way made sense. When the locomotive eventually returned to operation, after years of restoration effort, it was in some sense a different locomotive than it had been in regular service. It operated the same way in mechanical terms, it performed the functions it had been designed to perform, but it was operated by men who had learned through documentation and instruction rather than through the normal process of years of apprenticeship under experienced operators. The knowledge had been recovered, but it had been recovered imperfectly, and some of the subtle understanding that the men who had operated it regularly had possessed was likely lost forever. What the story of this locomotive reveals is something about how technological knowledge is transmitted and how it can be lost. The locomotive itself is a physical object that can be preserved. The knowledge of how to operate and maintain the locomotive is not a physical object, is not something that can be simply stored and protected from deterioration. The knowledge exists in people, in their memories, and in the communities of practice that maintain the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. When the community of practice is disrupted, when the generations no longer overlap in the way that would allow normal transmission of knowledge, the knowledge is at risk of being lost. The preservation effort that rescued the locomotive from scrapping preserved the physical machine but not the living knowledge of how to work with it. The effort to restore the locomotive to operation required recovering knowledge that had largely been dispersed or lost, reconstructing understanding from fragmentary sources, rebuilding the community of practice that had once maintained the knowledge. What makes this story particularly poignant is that the knowledge was not obscure or unnecessary or irrelevant. The knowledge was practical, was grounded in how to do things that needed to be done, was embodied in men who had spent their entire working lives learning it. The knowledge was valuable, but it was not written down in any comprehensive way. It was not recorded in instruction manuals or in technical documentation. It was held as practical understanding by men who had learned through experience. And when the men were gone, the knowledge was gone with them, unless someone made the effort to recover it before it disappeared entirely. The locomotive that sits today in heritage railway operations, that carries passengers on short excursion trains, that is maintained and cared for, is operating using knowledge that was barely rescued from complete loss. The people who maintain it and operate it are repositories of knowledge that they have had to reconstruct and recover, not knowledge that they have inherited through a normal transmission of learning. They carry the knowledge with the understanding that when they are gone, the knowledge will be distributed among many people, some of whom may have learned it thoroughly, and some of whom may have learned it only partially. The knowledge is fragile, exists in fewer people than it once did, is at risk of being lost again, if the organizations that maintain the locomotive do not continue to make the effort to preserve it. The physical preservation of the locomotive is straightforward. The preservation of the knowledge of how to work with it is ongoing, uncertain, requires constant effort and constant attention. The locomotive can be maintained indefinitely, given the resources and the will to maintain it. The knowledge can disappear in a generation, if the people who carry it do not pass it on, if the community of practice that maintain the knowledge is allowed to disperse. This is the particular tragedy of technological knowledge, the way that it can be lost even when the physical artifacts that embody the knowledge are carefully preserved. A machine can be saved from destruction. The understanding of how to work with the machine can still disappear. The locomotive in the museum is a monument not just to a particular design or a particular era of transportation, but to the fragility of knowledge, to the importance of communities of practice in maintaining understanding, to the way that the death of people can mean the death of knowledge that they carried. The men who operated and maintained the locomotive are mostly gone now. The locomotive itself continues to operate, continues to carry passengers, continues to exist as a physical object, but the knowledge of how to work with it exists now in a smaller circle of people than it once did, in people who have had to reconstruct that knowledge from incomplete sources, who carry it with the awareness that it is fragile and that effort is required to keep it from disappearing entirely. That is the locomotive that carried knowledge that nobody needed to keep, but that nearly everyone forgot to preserve until it was almost too late.